To finish the introduction, I want to talk about desiderata, a list of desirable things for a new theoretical framework, in particular for physics of cognition. Some of these ideas I've introduced already when I was talking about what the real problem was, so there's a lot of them, but it will go reasonably quickly, I think. So number one, we want to be able to do direct induction. We need a suitably impressionable substrate such that experience or contact with the world causes an imprint, a deformation that naturally constitutes an impression of what happened, of that interaction with the world. In other words, it creates a memory. Memory should happen by direct induction by the environment, so that stress between the subject and the environment causes memory, learning, problem-solving competence spontaneously when it's in a suitably impressionable substrate without needing to do search. In other words, it's a transformational theory. But it needs to be deep, not just a shallow or first-order imprint like your hand in clay, just the superficial appearance, not just a three-dimensional structure, but a deep structural model with internal organization that's induced by contact with the environment. And because it's doing induction, that means time has to be involved because you can't see all of it in one go. You have to make many observations over time in order to put that structure in order to be able to induce the hidden state. Then we'll have an impression that's not just a static structure, but it has dynamics. Its internal causal architecture models the outside world. We need to be able to do induction of a deep causal model easily. We also need it to be the case that it solves the mind-body problem, that it's embodied, embedded, and empowered, that when X models Y, X is not just a representation or a surface structure model or a movie of Y that has the same appearance, but that X has the same sensitivities to the world as Y, and X produces the same effects on the world as Y. I'm going to call that embedded and empowered. And that seems a little bit fantastical. You might call it a sort of causal impersonation, not just an impersonation, but an impersonation that has the same causes, the same effects in the world, so that the model does the work without an interpretation machinery or interpreter, so that we don't have a mind-body problem. Think about Newton's cradle, right? You lift up a weight on one end and you drop it, and it makes the weight on the other end come up. It is, in a sense, a model of what happened over here that happens over here, but it's a mirror of it, but it has the same causal efficacy. That model pushes back on this ball and it comes out the other end. Barton's pendulum, you have a bunch of pendulums of different lengths and one driving pendulum, and you swing the driving pendulum and it picks out the resonance through the string, picks out one particular pendulum that resonates to the driving pendulum. But that pendulum is itself a pendulum. It has the ability to drive other pendula if there were other pendula of the same length. It is also pushing back on the first pendulum. That's what happens when you put two metronomes on a wobbly board. One of them is producing a little vibration in the board, and it's causing the other one to entrain to it, to resonate with it in phase. But it's also pushing back. They are mutually co-defining one another. They're modeling each other. This needs to be substrate independent. The causal impersonation can be made out of different stuff, but work the same if they're suitably impressionable. So we could have a pendulum that keeps time, or a rotary timekeeping device, or the drip of water, or an electrical circuit with a vibrating crystal in it. And the coupling between those different substrates should work the same, that they can do causal impersonation of one another, even though they're made out of different stuff. So it doesn't really matter that the ball on one end of the Newton's cradle is made out of steel. It's only matters that it's capable of taking the same impulse and holding it for a moment and then delivering it back. So if the two systems are weakly coupled, the balls on the Newton's pendulum are arguably strongly coupled. If the two systems are weakly coupled, then they can induce or resonate with one another between those different substrates. It should also be scale invariant, that you can do a causal impersonation and make a little really, really tiny model of things, or make a huge model of things, or vice versa. If they're suitably impressionable, it should be scale blind, that any scale can talk to any other scale. A way to understand how this might work is coupling across scales, is that when you have a metronome of one that twice the frequency of another, which I've depicted as a small metronome, but it isn't really, it's a shorter pendulum, that will also phase lock with one another to produce a phase locking where one is beating twice for every one beat that the other one does. And it doesn't really matter whether that fast frequency metronome is made out of another metronome or whether it's made out of, I don't know, a gene regulation network or something. So long as there's some coupling between them, it doesn't matter that one is tiny and one is large and one's in one substrate and one's in another substrate, because they're in different substrates, they can be different sizes. If they resonate with one another, then they can still do that kind of causal coupling. Oh, here's a little story about how this might be relevant to the deer antlers. If you could move a vibration between substrates, I don't know if I'm ready for this story yet. I'm going to come back to it later. I'm just going to say for now, I'll come back to later about how this might help us understand what's going on with the deer antlers. Also, moving into the sort of cognitive realm rather than physical realm, it should be able to do abstraction. Do you have a many-to-one and a one-to-many relationship to represent general classes and specific instances at the same time? That many instances fold into one concept, a sort of compression, and unfold back into many instances. If you imagine the pendulums again, you have one driving pendulum, and maybe there were 4 other pendulums that were all the same length as that, and they would all resonate to that one heavy weight. Conversely, if you got all 4 of them swinging, even though they're light, they could get the larger mass pendulum to be the response, many-to-one, one-to-many. That works both ways. But the relationship shouldn't be one-to-one. There should be an underdetermination, that there are various small instances that fold into one large concept, into the constrained space. You induce a general class, and one large concept then folds into various small instances that's deconstraining into various variants or specific instances. David Bohm, quantum mechanics, talks about implicate order and explicate order, that there's a folding of space that takes all of the symmetries, and there's an unfolding of space that has all of the differences. And in all the way that those differences fold up in order to make that one implicate order, and physics is happening in both of those spaces at the same time, but one of them is underdetermined by the other. And to make this more mundane, to put it into a sort of physical realm, if we had a many-to-one relationship, but we also had that change in the length, the resonant harmonic between the pendulum with twice the length and the pendulum with half the length, like the big metronome and the small metronome that lock harmonically, then there's a phase underdetermination between the swing of one is 2 swings of the other, so they can be locked 2 different ways onto that phase locking that occurs. That's a clue about where we're heading. This will mean that the impression that it's taking is doing induction because of that underdetermination. Now, movements in the implicate order need to create movements in the explicate order. Multiple points in the high-dimensional unfolded explicate order correspond to a single point in the lower order folded space, the implicate order. But entities experience causes in both those spaces simultaneously. That if I alter the small pendulum, one of the small pendulum, or many small pendulum, or I alter the big pendulum, they are coupled with each other. The forces are moving back and forth between those 2 things. I'm not just pushing on one and the other is reacting. I'm not just pushing on this one and the other is reacting. I'm pushing on both of them when I touch them. Entities experience causes in both spaces simultaneously. In either one space, movements look ordinary. They look like the single order optimization process. If you just look at the big pendulum, it's just swinging. If you just look at the little pendulum, it's just swinging. But when you put them together, you have pendulums that appear to do something weird. This pendulum appears to be making itself swing. It's speeding up rather than slowing down, and it's swinging itself. Of course, it's not really swinging itself. It's because it's picked up, it has an energy which is coupled to the larger pendulum, which is driving it through the resonant vibrations. So my conjecture is that agential behavior, a behavior that looks agential in the folded space, is a projection of ordinary behavior in the unfolded space, is a projection of ordinary behavior in the folded space. It's a bit like saying that to the well-informed chess master, the next move is obvious. It's a forced move. There isn't any search required. It's just like, well, you have to do that. And that looks magical to the uninformed, but in the conditioned mental representation of the master, it's just a least action thing. It's just falling downhill for the chess master. It's all obvious. That makes things look like they're doing spooky things within a motive, like pendulums that speed up. But really, it's just a straight line in a curved space. This is artificial potential fields as a way of organizing agent behavior to move around obstacles. If you had a model of a potential field around the obstacle that pushed you away, and you do a least action path in that space, you go around the obstacle as though you could see it coming before you bumped into it. Now, this is something that we sometimes talk about in the context of evolution by natural selection. We talk about what's the prime directive, what's the meaningful direction to it all, because the meaningful direction for life seems to be different from the meaningful direction to physics. Physics seems to be on a unstoppable trajectory towards an increase in entropy. But living systems, at least locally, go the other way, creating order. Natural selection suggests a directionality of trying to increase survival and reproduction. I've heard people say to maximize inclusive fitness, if that floats your boat. But if there's a different prime mover, if it isn't selection that's doing it, what is the direction of that prime mover? Like if the direction was exactly the same, it wouldn't really matter. We would just be describing the same thing. Different words for describing the same process. But if they're not the same, then that's not what it's doing. It's not trying to increase survival and reproduction or maximize inclusive fitness. It's doing something else. What else? What is it optimizing? If we really understood what was happening, we ought to be able to answer that question, such that some movements in this space are better than others. Why do you need some movements to be better than others? Why can't you just say that's what it does? Because otherwise, if you don't say that, you're just saying stuff happens. You don't want to just say stuff happens. You want to say we want to understand it as in a goal-directed way. There isn't any intelligent action without goals. Otherwise, it's just different attractors. There isn't any adaptation without value. Otherwise, it's just different frequencies of stuff. So we need to understand what that prime mover is. So examples or possibilities of prime movers that people have talked about, right? So there's the what persists exists prime mover that just, if you don't change anymore, then you will carry on like that. And if you do change, then you won't be like that. So the things that you see are the things that don't change. This leads to refinements of stability and robustness, or ultra stability from Ashby. There's the moving towards order, or order for free, or self-organization. But we don't just want order. We want things to be adaptive. Well, there's adaptation, the idea that things are improving at what? At survival and reproduction. What would it mean if it wasn't about survival and reproduction? They're getting better at problem solving, better at resolving conflict or frustration, maybe. Or is it actually about a creative process? Because what problem are they solving? Are they still solving the survival and reproduction process, or is it something else? I'm going to suggest a movement that moves away from what persists exists, which has a sort of a static, sort of like you already had everything that was interesting and you're just picking out the ones you want to keep and the others that you're going to discard, but towards something which is a prime mover, which is fundamentally creative. That's almost polar opposite of what persists exists. We're in the territory, therefore, of talking about things like affect, what is it like, of value, which way is improvement, aim, what is it trying to do? And there's an issue here of what are you doing? Are you just taking an intentional stance because it's convenient? Or are we really doing an affect first way of understanding things? So I'm going to come back to this at the end, because it's related to the question of what does it all mean? And it's important that we talk about that, because otherwise we don't really have an intuitive understanding of how to interpret all of those details. Number 10, it should deal with recursive linguistic competence. The matter should be agential. It should be enzymatic as well as informational. We talk about this in the terms of the RNA world, right? That the RNA is informational, but it's also enzymatic. It also does stuff. So matter, the kind of matter that we're talking about, should be both. It should be information and it should do stuff. That the concepts do the work of what they mean. They execute their own function. They have causal power. They're not inert information that needs to be separate, that needs a separate interpreter or executive to read the information and then do it. They do it for themselves. Concepts should be zoomable, a sort of natural hierarchical ontology, the class-instance relationship, that we can manipulate them as abstract idealized types, or we can manipulate them as particular instances that are grounded in the specifics. Well, these are like a language that does stuff, right? We want a linguistic competence where we have productivity, that we can create an infinite number of possible utterances, compositionality, that the meaning of a system comes from the meaning of the parts that it contains plus their organization, that it has systematicity, that if you can understand the relationship between A and B, you can understand the relationship between B and A, and that it's recursive, that creates grammatical structures or sentences, plus some sort of very simple operator like merge that tells you how two sentences interact with one another, but not like we're manipulating passive data structures, but that they do it to each other, almost like it's a chemistry, a linguistic chemistry, a language with causal power, with the words that do stuff, that make stuff in sentences, that learn, that aren't static, that in interacting with one another, they get transformed and they do error correction. By being spoken, they self-correct themselves. Properties like that. Also, we need our theory to explain biology as we know it, or at least as we think we know it. We need it to explain how it organizes physical bodies and explains development. It explains how genetic encoding works, why genes sometimes at least control phenotypes, and why they often don't. But development and reproduction still works. We need to know how to read physical bodies and write them downwards to downward causation. That resolves or explains the genetic correlation between genotypes and phenotypes. We need to explain how it adapts over time. In other words, we need to explain biological evolution. It needs to be compatible with that, so that it explains how structures can be self-reproducing to write from one subject to another, and we can transfer the agential action or the self from one body to another, and explains, in other words, biological evolution, how it's so amazingly clever, and how that does have something to do with natural cognition. And finally, the 12th item on our list of desirable features is that it all arises spontaneously from nothing, with no designer, no programmer, no special machinery. It all arises, well, not from nothing. It arises from physics, from maths and geometry, from the interplay of space and time. I don't know, something pretty simple. Here's our list of 12. Direct induction from a suitably impressionable substrate that's deep, so that it has the same causal architecture, not just the same surface structure. That's not just a movie, but it's embedded and empowered. It has the same causal power in the world. That's substrate independent. You can implement it in anything. It's scale invariant. You can do it at any scale. It handles abstraction. You can go from many instances to one concept. That you can do induction because the relationships are underdetermined, that many instances which are different from one another correspond to one concept, and one concept unfolds into many different instances, that you get agential movements from ordinary movements in the implicate order that looks like they're clever, but really they're ordinary if you understand the space it's moving in. It has a prime directive that makes sense to us, a meaningful direction to life. It's recursive linguistic competence that's actually agential. It explains biology as we think we know it, and it arises spontaneously from nothing. That's what's needed to solve the deep recursive reverse engineering problem. And that's the conclusion to the introduction.